Hello and welcome to part 10 of Introduction to Sociology. We're going to read now the dialogue by Plato known as Meno. And it's named after Meno, General Meno. He was from Larissa, Thessaly, upland from Athens. And he is, during this dialogue, staying in Athens with Anamnesis. Anamnesis is going to be one of the people we'll see who prosecutes Socrates. Going to fight with Cyrus, King Kuros, who wants to take the throne of Persia away from his brother Artaxerxes. Meno, alas, is going to die on this campaign. We know about this campaign from Xenophon, his work, the Anamnesis, the March Up Country, and Xenophon, of course, is also going to write the second most important document about Socrates' trial. The famous story in the Anamnesis, the Greeks are seafaring people. They grow up near the sea. They come down from the mountains and they see the sea in front of them. They throw caution to the winds. They throw off their armor, throw down their weapons, go running into the sea to swim. Thalassa, Thalassa, they say, the sea, the sea. I understand what they're thinking, even though if there had been an enemy nearby, they would have been devastated. But I spent some time in Key West, and the Boy Scouts in Key West would go for a weekly summer camp up north. That means Miami. Now, Key West is a small island, 3 miles by 5 miles. You're never without a sight of the sea. But in Miami, they were. And they noticed the kids from Key West were getting a little blah and even nauseous during the stay there. It's only a week. So when the leaders devised a plan, they would take the Key West troops, only the Key West kids, about middle of the week to the ocean, and then they'd be fine for the rest of the week. They could make it. So like the Greeks, Thalassa, Thalassa. When they see the sea, they become very excited. There's going to be mention of Gorgias of Leontini, who was a first-generation sophist, came to Athens, died eventually in Larissa, Meno's hometown. Socrates met him when he was in Athens, and so did Meno when he was in Larissa. We've seen this question before, Tertullian's question, the church father. What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? And of course, what's the point of the question? Jerusalem, the city of religion, Athens, the city of philosophy. What hath faith to do with reason is what Tertullian is asking. Athens was indeed the city of philosophy, the school of Hellas, as Pericles said in his funeral oration, and those folks like Gorgias or Anaxagoras, mentioned in a couple of lectures ago, who were interested in philosophy began to gravitate toward Athens in the generation before and during the life of Socrates. And then philosophy, with that 3-generation, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, pretty much made philosophy take root permanently for centuries. It stayed the city of philosophy. So the school of Athens, here's Raphael's famous painting in the Vatican, depicting all the philosophers he knew, but certainly Plato and Aristotle, Plato holding his book Timaeus, gesturing upwards to the heavens. And by the way, that's Leonardo da Vinci. If you recognize the face, that's exactly who that was modeled on. Aristotle holding his book Ethics, gesturing to the earth. Gorgias had come to Athens as an ambassador from his native Leontini in Sicily. Pericles might have been his student. Socrates certainly met him and talked with him. So they're going to begin by discussing that. Then they're going to raise a central question in this dialogue. What is virtue? Arete, as the Greeks have it. So we're on page 86, the number at the top of the special edition, but it's also the number of the full second edition, which I think most of you watching on YouTube will probably have access to. And Meno begins its dialogue. Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice, or if neither by teaching nor by practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way? There was a time, Maino, when the Thessalians were famous among the other Hellenes for their riches and their writing, but now, if I'm not mistaken, they're famous also for their wisdom, especially at Larissa, which is the native city of your friend Aristippus. And this is Gorgias doing. For when he came there, he imbued with love and wisdom the flower of the Aleudae, among them your admirer Aristippus and the other chiefs of the Thessalians. And he has taught you the habit of answering questions in the grand and bold style, which is natural for those who know and may be expected from one who is himself ready and willing to be questioned on any subject by any Hellene and answers all comers. How different is our lot, dear Maino. Here in Athens, there's a dearth of the commodity, and all wisdom seems to have immigrated from us to you. I'm certain that if you were to ask any Athenian whether virtue was natural or acquired, he would laugh in your face and say, stranger, you have far too good an opinion of me if you think I can answer your question. For I literally do not know what virtue is, much less whether it is acquired by teaching or not. And I myself, Maino, living as I do in this region of poverty, am as poor as the rest of the world. And I confess with shame that I know literally nothing about virtue. And when I do not know the quid of anything, the what of anything, how can I know the qual, the nature of it? How, if I knew nothing at all of Maino, could I tell if he was handsome or the opposite, rich and noble or the reverse of rich and noble? Do you think I could? No, indeed. But are you in earnest, Socrates, in saying you do not know what virtue is? And am I to carry back this report of you to Thessaly? Not only that, my dear boy, but you may say further that I have never come across anyone else who did, in my judgment. Then you have never met Gorgias when he was at Athens? Yes, I have. And did you not think that he knew? I have not a good memory, Maino, and therefore I cannot now tell what I thought of him at the time. I dare say that he does know, and that you know what he said, so please, therefore, to remind me of what he said. Or, if you would rather, tell me your own view, for I suspect that you and he think very much alike. Very true. Then, as he is not here, never mind him. And do you tell me, I adjure you, Maino, be generous and tell me what you say that virtue is. For I shall esteem myself truly fortunate if I find that I have been mistaken and that you and Gorgias really have this knowledge, when I have been just saying that I've never met anybody who had. There will be no difficulty, Socrates, in answering your question. Let us first take the virtue of a man. He should know how to administer the state, and in the administration of it should benefit his friends and harm his enemies. That is a classic definition of politics. Benefit your friends, harm your enemies. And also, he must also be careful not to suffer harm himself. A woman's virtue, if you wish to know about that, may also easily be described. Her duty is to order her household and keep properly what is indoors and obey her husband. Every age, every condition of life, young or old, male or female, bond or free, has a different virtue. There are virtues numberless, and consequently, there is no difficulty about definitions. For there is a virtue relative to the actions and ages of each of us in all that we do. And I take it the same may be said of vice, Socrates. How fortunate I am, Maino! When I ask you for one virtue, you present me with a swarm of them, which are in your keeping. Suppose that I carried on the figure of the swarm and asked of you, what's the nature of the bee? And you answered, there are many different kinds of bees. And I replied, but are there many different kinds of bees because they differ qua bees, or not different qua bees? Are they distinguished from one another by something else, some quality such as beauty or size or some other such attribute? How would you answer me? I should answer the bees do not differ from one another qua bees. And if I went on to say, well, that is what I desire to know, Maino, tell me, what is the quality in which they do differ but are all alike? You would presumably be able to answer. I should. And so of the virtues, however many and different they may be, they all have a common form which makes them virtues. You know Socrates is going to say this, right? Given what he said to Euthyphro. Give me a common form, give me a common essence, give me the core meaning here. They all have a common form which makes them virtues. And on this, he who would answer the question, what is virtue, would do well to have his eye fixed. Do you understand? I'm beginning to understand, but I do not as yet take hold of the question as I could wish. When you say, Maino, that there is one virtue of a man, another of a woman, and so on, does this apply only to virtue, or would you say the same of health and size and strength? Or is the nature of health always the same, whether in man or woman? Well, I should say that health is the same, both in man and woman. And is not this true of size and strength? If a woman is strong, she will be strong by reason of the same form and the same strength subsisting in her, which there is in the man. I mean to say that strength as strength, whether of man or woman, is the same. Is there any difference? I think not. And will not virtue as virtue be the same, whether in a child or an old man, or in a woman or in a man? I cannot help but feeling, Socrates, that this case is different from the others. But why? Well, you're not saying that the virtue of a man was to order a state, and the virtue of a woman was to order a household? I did say so. And can either household or state or anything be well ordered without temperance and without justice? Certainly not. Then they who order a state or a house temperately and justly, order them with temperance and justice? Certainly. Then both men and women, if they are to be good men and women, must have the same virtues of temperance and justice? Clearly. And could either a young man or an elder one ever become good while they were intemperate and unjust? Well, certainly not. They must be temperate and just, yes. Then all human beings are good in the same way and become good by possession of the same virtues? Such is the inference. And they surely would not have been good in the same way unless their virtue had been the same. They would not. Then, now that the sameness of all virtue has been proven, try and remember what Gorgias and you with him say that virtue is. I don't know what to say, but that virtue is the power of governing mankind, if you really want to have one definition of them all. That is indeed what I want. Now, consider this point. Can virtue, as you define it, be the virtue of a slave or a child or a slave, Maino? Can the child govern his father or the slave his master? And would he who governed be any longer a slave? I think not, Socrates. No, indeed. There would be small reason in that. Yet once more, fair friend, according to you, virtue is, quote, the power of governing, unquote. But shall we not add, quote, justly and not unjustly? Yes, Socrates, I agree. I agree there. For justice is virtue. Would you say virtue, Maino, or a virtue? What do you mean? I mean, as I might say about anything, that roundness, for example, is a figure, and not simply figure, that I should adopt this mode of speaking because there are other figures. Oh, quite right. And that is just what I say about virtue, that there are other virtues as well as justice. What are they? Tell me the names of them, as I would tell you the names of the other figures if you asked me. Courage, and temperance, and wisdom, and the noble way of life are virtues, it seems to me. And there are many others. Yes, Maino, and again we are in the same case. In searching after one virtue, we have found many, though not in the same way as before, but we've been unable to find the common virtue which runs through them all. Here again he's looking for this essence. Why, Socrates, even now I am not able to help you in your inquiry and get at one common notion of virtue as in the other cases. No wonder, but I will try to get us nearer if I can. You perhaps understand that this reasoning applies universally. Suppose that someone asked you the question which I asked before, Maino, what is figure? And you answered roundness. He would reply to you in my way of speaking by asking whether roundness is figure or a figure. And you, of course, would answer a figure, certainly. And for this reason that there are other figures, yes. And if you proceeded to ask what other figures are there, you would have told him, I should. And if he similarly asked what color is, and you answered whiteness, and the questioner rejoined, would you say that whiteness is color or a color? And you would reply a color because there are other colors as well. I should. And if he had said, tell me what they are, you would have told him of the other colors, which are colors just as much as whiteness. Maino says, yes. Socrates gets all the good lines, doesn't he? And then Socrates continues, and suppose that he were to pursue the matter in my way, he would say, ever and anon we are landed in particulars, but that is not what I want. Tell me then, since you call them by a common name and say that they are all figures even when opposed to one another, what is that common nature which you designate as figure, which contains round no less than straight, and as you say, belongs to one no more than to the other? That would be your mode of speaking, yes. And in speaking thus, do you mean to say that the round is no more round than the straight, or the straight no more straight than the round? Of course not. You only assert that the round figure is figure no more than the straight, or the straight than the round. Very true. To what then do we give the name of figure? Try and answer. Suppose that when a person asked you this question, either about figure or color, you were to reply, my good sir, I do not understand what you want or know what you mean. He would look rather astonished and say, do you not understand that I'm looking for that which is identical in all the particulars? And then he might put the question in another form. Maino, he might say, what is there identical in the round, the straight, and everything else that you call a figure? Could you not answer that question, Maino? I wish you would try. The attempt will be good practice for the answer about virtue. I would rather that you should answer, Socrates. Shall I indulge you? By all means. And then you will tell me about virtue? I will. Then I must do my best, for there is a prize to be won. Certainly. Well, I will try to explain to you what figure is. What do you say to this answer? Figure is the only thing which accompanies color. Will you be satisfied with it, as I'm sure I should be if you let me have a similar definition of virtue? But Socrates, that is such an artless answer. Why artless? Because, according to you, figure is that which always accompanies color. Very well. But if a person were to say that he does not know what color is any more than what figure is, what sort of answer would you give him? In my opinion, the truth. And if he were a philosopher of the heuristic and contentious sort, I should say to him, You have my answer, and if I am wrong, your business is to take up the argument and refute me. But if we were friends and talking as you and I are now, I would, of course, to reply in a milder strain and more in the dialectician's vein. That is to say, I should not only speak the truth, but I should make use of premises which the person interrogated would be willing to admit. And this is the way in which I shall endeavor to approach you. You will acknowledge, will you not, that there is such a thing as an end or termination or extremity, all of which words I use in the same sense, although I'm aware that Prodicus might disagree on this point. But still, you, I imagine, would speak of a thing as ended or terminated. That's all I'm saying, nothing subtle. Yes, I should, and I believe that I understand your meaning. And you would speak of a surface and also of a solid, as for example in geometry? Yes. Well then, you are now in a condition to understand my definition of figure. I define figure to be always that in which the solid finds its limit, or more concisely, the limit of solid. And now, Socrates, what is color? You are outrageous, Meno, in thus plaguing a poor old man to give you an answer, when you will not take the trouble of remembering Gorgias' definition of virtue. And when you have told me what I ask, I will tell you, Socrates. A man who is blindfolded has only to hear you talking, and he would know that you are a beautiful creature and still have lovers. Why do you think so? Why, because you always speak in imperatives, like proud beauties who reign with absolute power, so long as they are in their prime. And also, I suspect that you have found out that I have a weakness for beauty, and therefore, to humor you, I must answer. Please do. Would you like me to answer you after the manner of Gorgias, in which you may find it easiest to follow me? I should like nothing better. Let's stop here and run through what they've done so far. Okay. They're asking about virtue, arete. Many Greek terms are hard to translate into English because often they connote things that the Greek term didn't. For example, people are inclined to translate Hades into the Christian hell, not at all the same thing. Arete is like this too. It means excellence. The term virtue in English has kind of a prissy connotation, which the Greek arete doesn't carry at all, and a moral meaning in general, which it doesn't carry. Various occupations have their own arete. There's the arete of wrestlers, as Guthrie says, riders of generals, shoemakers, slaves, etc. There's political arete, domestic arete, military arete. It means efficiency. It was vocational. And this is the kind of answer, sort of conventional Greek answer, that Meno is giving to Socrates. So his first attempt, he says, the virtue of a man is he knows how to administer the state, the virtue of woman that she knows how to administer the household. Oikos was the Greek word from which we get our word economy. Economics we now think of as extending far beyond a household, but the household was where economic activity took place indeed in many societies for some time. So Meno is, again, giving voice to the conventional view. Men run politics, women do the other stuff. Women raise children and manage the household, and men do all the important stuff. It was also conventional that women should be neither seen nor heard. Pericles in the funeral oration, the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticizing you. They kept to their household, they visited the neighbors, but basically they didn't go out in public. It's not unlike some of the situation in some contemporary Islamic republics, for example, when a woman has to be accompanied outside of the household by a male relative and that sort of thing. Although, as we noted with the Panathenaic festival, they were allowed to go out to that festival. Meno is an aristocrat, and he thinks that virtue of the sort just comes as a matter of course to aristocrats like himself. Socrates, though, is shifting the terms of address. He's trying to get Meno to think whether virtue might be an inner state available potentially to all people without respect to their social standing, whether they're slave or free, male or female, old or young. If you hear echoes of St. Paul later on, you're not wrong. And Socrates is going to take the same idea again in the Republic, arguing that virtue is function. But here he's got something else going on with Meno. He wants Meno to give him, again, that essence of virtue, and not the particulars, not the examples. Remember what he said to Euthyphro. And he wants the core of what makes virtue virtue as such. And here again, of course, he is engaged in the classic Socratic method, the elenchus. He's proposing a definition and then trying to shoot that definition down. So Meno gives it a second try. Okay, let's try it again. Virtue is the power of governing mankind. But Socrates says not all people govern others, and your example still falls short of being universal. You've described a virtue, not virtue in general, and then he goes into this discussion about figure and color. And the question here, which comes up a lot in Plato and a lot in the course of philosophy, has to do with names, with particulars and universals. How is it that we can use a common general name to describe a variety of particular things which differ in some ways amongst themselves, but will still get that common name? And Plato's strategy here is to look for some sort of common essence. So if we talk about various things being virtue, we should expect to find some kind of common core definition of virtue that would cover them all. Later on in the 20th century, Wittgenstein is going to take up this problem in rather a different way, that we use names because the objects have certain family resemblances one to another, and the search for a core essence, the Platonic search, which many people have done for a long time, is just barking up the wrong tree. So what's the essence of figure? Okay, what's identical around the straight, everything else you call figure? Tough question. Meno draws a blank. It's the only thing, says Socrates, which accompanies color. Okay, and Meno is not, he's giving Socrates a hard time. He's not completely satisfied with this, but then he's going to ask Socrates to give him a paradigm answer, an exemplary answer that he can then follow. Would you like me to answer you after the manner of Gorgias, in which you may find it easiest to follow me, says Socrates? And Meno says, I should like nothing better. Do not you and he and you and Empedocles say that there are certain effluences from existing things? Certainly. And passages into which and through the effluences pass? Exactly. And some of the effluences fit into the passages, and some of them are too small or too big? True. And there is such a thing as sight? Yes. And now, as Pindar says, read my meaning. Color is an effluence of figures commensurate with sight and palpable to sense. That, Socrates, seems to me to be an admirable answer. This needs a little explanation. We talked about some of the pre-Socratics. We did not talk about Empedocles, but here's an interesting idea that Empedocles had that actually it runs completely contrary to the way we look at things, but it was influential for quite a long time in optics. Here Simon Schaeffer is going to, he's at Mount Etna in Sicily, where Empedocles was from. In fact, he was involved with this volcano. He's going to explain what that idea is.
Empedocles put forward the extraordinary idea that we see objects because light streams out of our eyes and touches them. And it makes an enormous amount of sense. The model is something like a lighthouse. I'm seeing things because something streams from my eyes towards them. And as my gaze touches them, they come into view.
Yes. So basically, when we see, according to Empedocles, our eyes are sending out feelers, as it were. That's not the way we look at things, is it? Now, for example, if I look at this, I guess it's a donkey, here's what I think is happening. There's a light source, and it's illuminating the donkey. Can't see him in the dark. You can see him better in the sunlight than in the shade. More light is better. And then that light bounces off and takes the rays, bounces off that object, the donkey in this case, and then reflected from that donkey conveys itself through my lens back to the back of my eyeball, and then the optic nerve picks it up in the brain, processes it, etc., etc. But here's Empedocles' view. The donkey sends out a donkey effluence, and my eye sends out a corresponding effluence, and our effluence is basically touch. Reach out and touch someone. No, not there. So color is an effluence of figures commensurate with sight and palpable to sense. Palpable, touchable. Empedocles actually believe that when we see something, we are, in a sense, the feelers from our eyes are kind of reaching out and touching that object and making physical contact with it. And this, of course, is something that Meno takes for granted, and Socrates is willing to work with as well, which takes some explanation for us. That Socrates' Meno appears to me to be an admirable answer. Why, yes, because it happens to be the one in which you've been in the habit of hearing. and your wit will have discovered, I suspect, that you may explain in the same way the nature of sound and smell, and of many other similar phenomena. Quite true. The answer, Meno, was in the solemn language of tragedy, and therefore was more acceptable to you than the other answer about figure. Yes? And yet, O son of Alexidemus, I cannot help thinking that the other was the better. And I believe that you would be of the same opinion if you would only stay and be initiated, and were not compelled, as you said yesterday, to go away before the mysteries. But I will stay, Socrates, if you will give me many such answers. Well then, for my own sake, as well as for yours, I will do my very best, but I'm afraid that I shall not be able to give you very many as good. And now, in your turn, you are to fulfill your promise and tell me what virtue is in the universal. And do not make a singular into a plural, as the facetious always say of some of those who break a thing, but leave virtue whole and sound when you tell me its nature. I've given you the pattern. So, Meno gives a third attempt here. Well then, Socrates, virtue, as I take it, is when he who desires things which are lovely is able to provide them for himself. So the poet says, and I say too, that virtue is the desire of things that are lovely with the power to attain them. And does he who desires the things that are lovely also desire the good? Certainly. Then there are some who desire the evil and others who desire the good? Do not all men, my dear sir, desire the good? I think not. There are some who desire evil? Yes. Do you mean that they think that the evils which they desire to be good, or that they know they are evil and yet desire them? Both, I think. And do you really imagine, Meno, that a man knows evils and desires them notwithstanding? Certainly I do. Desire is of possession, yes, of possession. And does he think that evils do good to him who possesses them, or does he know that their presence does harm? Well, there are some who think that evils do them good, and others who know that they do them harm. And in your opinion, do those who think that they do them good know that they are evils? I would not go so far as that. Is it not obvious that those who are ignorant of their nature, says Socrates, do not desire them, but desire what they suppose to be goods, although they are really evils? And therefore, if in their ignorance they suppose evils to be goods, they really desire goods. Well, in that case, no doubt. Again, those who, as you say, desire evils and think that evils are hurtful to the possessor of them, presumably know that they will be hurt by them? They must know it. And must they not suppose that those who are hurt are miserable in proportion to the hurt which is inflicted upon them? How can it be otherwise? But are not the miserable ill-fated? Yes, indeed. And does anyone desire to be miserable and ill-fated? I should say not, Socrates. But if there is no one who desires to be miserable, there is no one, Meno, who desires evil. For what is misery but the desire and possession of evil? And then Meno says, that appears to be the truth, Socrates, and I admit that nobody desires evil. Okay. This is one of three very weird ideas that Plato has his character Socrates introduce in the Meno. Nobody really desires evil. And if they desire things which are objectively evil, it can only be because they are ignorant of what they're doing. So Socrates' approach to morals is to say people never do the wrong thing willingly. If they were only better educated, they would always do the right thing. That virtue, moral virtue at least, is the moral goodness. Confuse it with virtue. Moral goodness is the pursuit clear-sightedly of what you see to be the good. And the only thing which deters you from that is lack of clarity. What is the nature of evil? This is a weird idea that evil is never desired, but only mistakenly desired by humans. Nobody desires evil, says Maino. Wow, nobody desires evil? It's possible to read Socrates to this effect. All people are basically good. There is no evil, there's just ignorance, error, lack of understanding, that sort of thing. Gurdjieff says of this subject, one may say that evil does not exist for subjective man at all, that there exist only different conceptions of good. Nobody ever does anything deliberately in the interest of evil for the sake of evil. Everybody acts in the interest of good as he understands it, but everybody understands it in a different way. Consequently, men drown, slay, and kill one another in the interests of good. Now, Is there just a basic circularity going on there? Isn't Socrates merely defining good here as that which people desire, regardless of whether the things that they desire psychologically are in fact substantively good or substantively evil, worthy of desire or unworthy of desire, respectively? And if he's just doing this, just defining good psychologically, isn't he doing essentially the same thing that he took Euthyphro to task for in the previous dialogue? Euthyphro says the holy is whatever the gods love. Even wicked things like Titan fathers cannibalizing their Olympian sons, or Olympian sons gelding their Titan fathers, or Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, or Agamemnon slaughtering Iphigenia to get fair winds for his voyage. If Socrates was right to criticize Euthyphro, then isn't it equally foolish of Socrates to say, for the very same reason, well, the desirable is whatever people desire psychologically? Is something desirable because it's desired, or is it desired because there's something intrinsically desirable about it? Let's draw a distinction here. As Mr. Samler, character in one of Saul Bellow's novels, tells us, one had to learn to distinguish and distinguish and distinguish. It was distinguishing and not explanation that mattered. Explanation was for the mental masses. I want to draw a distinction here between a weak version of the claim, or weak claim, and a strong claim, which might otherwise be confused. The weak claim is that everybody seeks the good. The strong claim is that nobody seeks evil. Which is the case, or are they both the case? Does Socrates mean everyone desires the good psychologically, but that they might be mistaken epistemologically in identifying what the good is, that everybody's intentions are good? Okay, that's the weaker claim. Or does he mean the stronger claim, no one truly desires what's objectively evil, even when they seem to desire those things while mistaking them for the good? That nobody's intentions are substantively evil, that's the stronger claim. So everybody's intentions are good, the weaker claim, nobody's intentions are evil, is stronger. Okay. If Socrates is correct that Euthyphro loses control over words like good and evil, aren't we paying the same price here if we confuse these two? Well, we all want the best, and the best is what we all want. On and on, round and round it goes. Again, recall Euthyphro. Does anyone really say, sure, I do evil and I'm above the law? Don't they rather define good in ad hoc ways so that by definition, whatever they pursue is good? Oh, I'm just robbing from the rich to give to the poor, but it's because the rich robbed the poor in the first place. I'm just doing distributive justice, says Robin Hood. He may be right. But if Socrates here is defining whatever people desire as good, then doesn't this just boil down to what is a completely empty claim that people desire what they desire? The heart wants what the heart wants. Well, okay, and who can argue with that? So in other words, is there not a basic circularity somewhere in the vicinity? Let's take the weaker claim first. Everyone's intentions are good. There are at least two separable issues here. First of all, is it the best explanation of human behavior that humans pursue evil? And secondly, are moral explanations the best explanations in the first place? Let's take them up in reverse order. Is moralism our best and first resort in conversation? Or could honest people just disagree honestly? Learning to suspend moral judgment can be a good idea. Can it be a bad thing to start by recognizing that just because somebody disagrees with me doesn't mean they proceed from evil intentions or pursue evil ends? Let's take two people here, A and B. They're arguing about abortion. And person A says there is a right to an abortion, and person B says abortion is murder, and therefore it's beyond the question of rights. You may have rights, but you don't have a right to murder, and that's what abortion is. Now, you could just moralize, and you could throw hostile comments back at each other. You're a member of the misogynistic basket of deplorables. You're a callous baby killer. They could each assume, in other words, the other party operates from bad motives. Or they could try to see what the other regards, whether they're doing that rightly or not, as the good. So person A, who believes that there is a right to an abortion, might very well say, well, if you're right that a conceptus is a person, conceptus being the umbrella term for fetus and embryo, then I suppose abortion would be murder if that were true. And person B, who thinks that abortion is wrong because it is murder, might say to the other one, well, if you're right and a conceptus is not yet a person, then yeah, I can see your point. It wouldn't trump a woman's right to choose her life. At the same time, entertaining these ideas doesn't mean that they have to give up their own point of view. They're just, dealing with hypotheses. Ideas are like guests. You can invite them, you can entertain them. You don't have to let them take up residence. If a conceptus is a person, then I suppose abortion would be murderous as person A, but I disagree with you. A conceptus is not yet a person. Well, if a conceptus is not yet a person, then it would not trump a woman's right to life, but a conceptus is a person, it is a rights bearer in its own right, and therefore to terminate its life is tantamount, is indeed, in fact, murder. At the very least, they could discuss their differences. I disagree with you, but I'm pretty sure you're not Hitler. Is an enemy the same thing as a villain? Maybe the other guy is not evil, just mistaken, or maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe we're coming from legitimately different perspectives. Maybe we're talking apples and oranges. There may be a resolution, there may not be, but talking about it at least could establish some common ground and might be a first step in the direction of coming to some common ground. There may be certain cognitive gains in learning to suspend moralism, civility, of course, being one of them. Whoever says Hitler first loses. But in a broader sense, as you become more educated men and women, you'll learn to suspend judgment on certain professional issues. If you become an historian, for example, or same is true of becoming an anthropologist or a sociologist or a psychologist, you're thinking about ideas, you want to understand first and foremost what ideas mean or meant to the persons involved. And particularly for historians, this is a cardinal thing. What historians want to avoid is what they call and stigmatize as present-mindedness. The past is a foreign country, and we are strangers there. People in the past did not necessarily use the same conceptual framework that people in the present use. And so you've got to pay attention to what their conceptual framework was, what they were after, what they thought was important, how they looked at the world, particularly in pre-scientific settings. This could be very, very different. And moralism gets in the way of this. It kind of cuts through all the complexities and just goes to one particular issue. So what you want to learn not to do if you're dealing in any sort of comparative study at all is not to retroject or introject frames of reference into a conversation that weren't there to begin with. That's anachronism. That's present-mindedness. Abe Lincoln with his boombox, the Whig interpretation of history, as it's sometimes been called. So moralism can be a kind of present-mindedness, where we think of progress as that long, steep path which leads to me, as Jean-Paul Sartre says. We only look at the past as a development toward the present and don't see it in its own right, as the people themselves would have seen their own times, not in terms of leading up to a future with us in it that they could not possibly have imagined. Think, for example, about the history of religion. Okay, so let's say that you're a religious believer. You're a Christian. Here, I'll put the dog collar on the guy to indicate that. And he looks at Baal worship, which is described in Tanakh. The Israelites did this. Baal was a Canaanite god, and various folks in the story in Tanakh were inclined to worship him. And, one response is, what a deplorable basket of idol worshippers, or basket of deplorable idol worshippers. Or the identical person might suspend the moralistic response and think about what this meant to a Baal devotee. Well, he was a god of fertility. He was a thunderer. He was like Zeus. He was like the Hebrew god Yahweh in that respect. In many ways, they were similar. And try to understand. Now, there's a point of view which says, Tolstoy expresses that, to understand all is to forgive all. But is this true? Do you have to give up your own moral, aesthetic, other sorts of value predilections just in order to entertain what things may have looked like from another point of view? I wonder if that's necessarily true. This guy with the dog collar can look at the Baal religion and try to understand it and still say, I'm not getting into idol worship. I'm not going to bow down to Baal and do that. But I want to understand what that meant at the time to those people. It doesn't mean understanding all does not necessarily mean forgiving all. And setting aside the good and evil question can be a way of avoiding polarization. Don't we see a lot of polarization these days? Very bad people flaming wars on the internet, on Twitter, social media, all that stuff. Manichaean dualism, dividing the universe into the good people versus the bad people, the children of light and the children of darkness. Isn't this just cartoonish, like the actual cartoon in Mad Magazine years ago, Spy versus Spy? They were kind of mirror images one of another. Or consider literary work. Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist. Suspending moral judgment is not the immorality of the novel, it is its morality. We might suspend moral judgment in the interest of understanding why people act as they do, even if what they do seems to us bizarre, unreasonable, even morally offensive. And, literature is like this. You read literature not just written by people of your own kind or within your own silo of your own ethnicity, your own point of view, but you read literature written by people from very different backgrounds and very different outlooks, and you try to get, interpretively into the head of somebody like that in order to understand, what the world looks like, maybe consider some other possibilities. And yet you don't always have to invite all those possibilities to take up residence in your own head, but at least it broadens your awareness. So if something is morally unforgivable, must it be incomprehensible? What if we just in the first instance forego moralizing in favor of comprehending? And maybe this is what Socrates and Meno are up to. Nobody desires evil. Now, is it then the best explanation, this is the first question, that humans never pursue evil? Even granting the second proposition that moralism may not be our first best resort, is this the case that human beings never pursue evil? Well, certainly our religious traditions tell us otherwise. Evil is basic. Human nature is full of evil intentions. Adam and Eve got thrown out of the garden, after all, because they sinned. And it has been our tendency as their descendants to be sinners ever since, or at least the religious traditions tell us. Or maybe not. Maybe human nature isn't black and white, but black and gray. In any case, biblical religions do tell us that humans are sinners almost by essence. Socrates asserts that human evil is just an accident. Does it make any sense to see humans as either intrinsically evil or intrinsically good? Is there a human nature? If so, what is it? We looked at this a little bit earlier in this section on metaphysics. Maybe there is no such thing as human nature. In the first place, Jean Paul Sartre famously says this, and we are condemned to freedom. We are free to do anything we want except to be unfree. There's a kind of negative nature that constrains us there, but anything else is up for grabs. Maybe, yea, the Judeo-Christian tradition says we do have a nature, it's prone to sin and evil. Maybe, yea, another way. Maybe we're basically good, or at least not basically bad, and can become good. Maybe Rousseau was right. Humans in a state of nature were basically good, but society has caused us to degenerate from the golden age to which we might try to get ourselves back to the garden. Recent centuries, however, had not been kind either to Socrates or to Rousseau. The path from the 18th century of Rousseau to the 20th century in particular was a very twisted path. At first we expected progress, every day in every way I'm getting better and better. This is a characteristic view of the 19th century. And you can see why they might have thought that, because they did see a lot of progress going on among them. We talked about this in the section on ethics, about how, within 200 years, slavery has been virtually abolished. Human flourishing has gone up in lots of ways. Infant mortality has gone down, that quintuple A number we discussed. Lots of things vis-a-vis human health. And in the 19th century, this is happening as well. Public sanitation, lots of different things going on. The death rate was declining. Intellectual progress occurring with the Enlightenment, with the growth of science, with technology, celebrated throughout the 19th century. So why shouldn't moral progress happen too? That was a standard expectation. One can see why it might have made sense. Could the brotherhood of man, perhaps even the abolition of war, be around the corner? It was hard to see what was approaching. Here's a voice from 1913. A new and luminous signpost On the road toward progress where humanity halts, gathers itself, reflects, and judges the state of global civilization in order to advance more surely to new and decisive triumphs. This is 1913 from the Universal Exposition at Ghent, Belgium, at the World's Fair, October 1913. Within less than a year, Belgium would be in deep doo-doo. World War I with its slaughter had begun. And the 20th century in general was a century of mass death. Whether we start with the Armenian genocide during the time of the First World War or the slaughter in the trenches in the First World War itself. I can still remember, you rarely see this anymore, but old subway cars in France, the seats next to the door reserved for pregnant women and those mutilated in the war. Well, those mutilated in the war, there aren't many anymore, but between the two wars, yes, there were. There was a whole generation of women who wore black all their lives because all the men they might have married had been vaporized. There wasn't even enough of a body to bury with high explosive artillery in the First War. It was tremendous slaughter, and it decimated England, France, Germany, other societies as well. We Americans only went in the last year, and it was bad enough for the Americans, but it was so much worse for the combatants that were there from 1914 onward. The war ends, and the Russians declare a Soviet Union. Red Terror begins in 1919. Stalin's purges in the 1930s. People shot, for virtually nothing. The Holocaust, Nazi death camps. Shortly thereafter, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Genocide throughout the end of the 20th century in Cambodia, the Balkans, Rwanda, on and on it goes. In short, after Auschwitz. After Auschwitz, much has changed. It's the title of a book by one of my teachers, Richard Rubenstein. Yes, after Auschwitz. Are humans basically good, but just in need of reform or education, or is human evil a force in its own right? The optimism that one saw in the 18th century and the 19th century, after the middle of the 20th century, or beginning of the 20th century, throughout the 20th century, no longer so easy to sustain. Now, Socrates asks Meno, if in their ignorance they suppose the evils to be goods, do they really desire goods? Meno says, that appears to be the truth, Socrates, and I admit that nobody desires evil. Now, on this view, it seems to be two things are the case. Evil is not a force in its own right, it's just the absence of good. And evil is the byproduct of ignorance. So if you want to improve morality, you improve education, you reduce ignorance. If evil is just the product of ignorance, then nobody could act against their better judgment by knowing evil but choosing it anyway. This seems to be an implication of what Socrates says. Aristotle had a different view. It's known as akrasia, means weakness of will, incontinence. It's an unfortunate term, as opposed to being enkratic, as opposed to having enkratia, being possessed, self-possessed, continent, etc., self-mastered, and so forth. Now, common sense tells us that akrasia occurs all the time. We don't need to read Freud, but living now in a post-Freud world, we should be well aware that neurotic self-sabotage is very common. It's part of, I had a whole book of the title of The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, right? So, I know better than to eat junk food, lie around all day, and swill beer. So therefore, I don't ever do those things, do I? Right. Is there such a thing as denial? Can we, deep down inside, know what's true while at the same time developing rationalizations? Freud says, yes, we do it a lot. South says Freud doesn't go far enough. We're constantly doing this sort of thing. It's what South calls bad faith. But Socrates says, no, we never knowing and willingly sabotage our own best interests. And if we so act, it can only be because we don't know. We know not what we do. I'll tell you a personal story on me. I need to go back on the Dr. Atkins diet. You can't see below my bow tie, but there's a big pot right there. You can hear it. And the one diet that works for me is the Dr. Atkins diet. Now, Atkins is a weird diet in that it's a diet where you don't have to go hungry. The Dr. Atkins diet works on the following principle. Fat does not make fat. Carbohydrates make fat. Body stores up fat by consuming carbohydrates. If it's deprived of carbohydrates, it will start consuming its own fat, and that will result in weight loss. So if you go on the Atkins diet, what you do is you induce a state called ketosis, and you can measure this with certain test strips to see how it's going. And once your body gets into that state of ketosis, then it starts to burn its own fat, and gradually, the weight will drop. But you cannot have more than something like 20 grams of carbohydrates a day. So you have to be very careful about your food intake. But on the other hand, you can eat all kinds of things. You eat all the red meat that you want, all the fish you want, all the cheese you want. You can have cream. You can, if you like chocolate, I'm not particularly chocoholic, but one thing I like to do in Atkins is I get heat up some cream, mix in some Belgian chocolate, a little bit of chipotle pepper, a little kick Mexican chocolate, and some Splenda, which is left-handed sugar that doesn't act like actual sugar, and then drink away. And you can have as much of that, as much chocolate as you want. You can make chocolate fudge as long as you use Splenda rather than sugar. Anything with cream, but you can't have milk, because milk has carbohydrates. Cream is just the fat that comes to the top, all of that you want. So yeah, you don't have to go around hungry. And, it's unlike the typical diet where you're starving yourself. You have to plan. So, when I was on Atkins, I'd always have a grilled chicken breast nearby. So if I got the munchies, instead of grabbing a bag of potato chips or going out to 7-Eleven, whatever, I just go to my fridge, have a little chicken. It's good till the next mealtime. So I remember I had done this years and years and years ago, but about 20 years ago, my son's then girlfriend's father had just lost 50 pounds on Atkins, and I said, "Yeah, I need to lose a substantial amount of weight." So I went and bought a new copy of the book. I lost my old copy, and I went and sat down on the couch to read the book, and I got myself some celery because celery is diet food, right? And I'm munching on the celery, and in the back, Dr. Atkins gives you a carbohydrate count. Turns out that celery is one of the worst things you can eat from the standpoint of carbohydrates. But it's rabbit food. Diets are, for rabbits. No. It's a very different diet. But the hardest thing about the diet is the mental bit, wrapping your head around some different ideas. So I found, I could have all the steak that I wanted, but I could only have maybe a little cup of salad most a day. And I found myself lusting after celery, like some people just lust after, I don't know, chocolate cake or whatever. Yeah, and I knew better, but it didn't stop me from eating a little celery every once in a while. So Aristotle's akrasia. Self-sabotage, you shouldn't, but you just can't seem to help yourself. No, Tink, no, stay away. Socrates doesn't think that happens. Okay, let's also look at means, ends, consequences, whether intended or unintended, in terms of what Socrates said. Because Socrates' view in Meno doesn't seem to recognize with the unintended consequences of our action, nor with the problematic relationship of means to ends. Suppose, for example, I know what's right and I want to do it, okay? For Socrates, this is all I need. I know it should be the end of my action, and I choose means, act in such a way that my means will achieve those ends. But even if I know, and even if I so act, there are further problems, and Socrates doesn't seem to be aware of these at all. What means shall I choose? Acts involve both means and ends. My chosen means might not succeed in achieving the end that I intend, or my chosen means might achieve ends that I didn't envision, never intended. And even if I know what's right and I intend to do what's right, I may still act in such a way as to achieve ends which are themselves either wrong and or counterproductive. So suppose, for the sake of argument, we grant the weak thesis, everyone's intentions are good. Nonetheless, if the means you choose to achieve your ends also predictably involve other unintended ends that are not so good, then doesn't choosing such means entail choosing those ends in effect? In other words, do good intentions always guarantee good consequences? Oh, good boy, he's well-intentioned, he's fetching. Once we choose means and they can carry with them ends and consequences in addition to the consequences intended. We've already looked at this a little bit. We talked about Aquinas and the double effect. When we come to the end of the course, almost next to the last lecture, we talk about Hegel. We'll talk about what he calls the cunning of reason. My friend Robert Merton has the classic modern essay on unintended consequences, latent functions of our actions. So when we act, we intend. That is, we choose to act in such a way as to bring about intended ends, goals. And we try to choose the means appropriate. But sometimes our means do get our intended ends, and sometimes they also get unintended ends, which we neither chose directly nor foresaw. And again, this comes up a lot. I mentioned Merton in modern times, John Locke, Adam Smith, the invisible hand, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes, you intend well, but you can't do what you intend. I think I may have mentioned I worked my day job for many years with the public schools, and for the longest time, my school district refused to use software to block inappropriate sites from the students. Now, you think you want to do that, and eventually that school district, and all of them did, because Orrin Hatch from Utah, Senator Orrin Hatch, put through some legislation requiring all school districts to do this as a way to get federal funds. That's the main way in which the federal state imposes its power. And so all the districts had to get some kind of software. But the reason they resisted was because of liability, because the software is imperfect. You cannot design a foolproof software package that will filter out all the inappropriate things, but let in all the appropriate things. And so if you, in effect, promise the parents at a school district that we have software that can do this and it doesn't do that thing, you may be legally liable. That's why the districts, even though, they tend to be control freaks, they resisted this kind of control because it might have blowback, but they were forced to do it anyway. And one example of why they might have been cautious is what's called the Scunthorpe problem. AOL blocked all references to the town of Scunthorpe, Lincolnshire, because there is an inappropriate word in that name. And Penistone, Yorkshire, there's an old joke. Somebody calls up in the days before the internet. They call up the operator. Can you give me Penistone? Can you spell that? P-E-N-I-S. Pervert. Hangs up. Coburn is a surname, but it has an inappropriate word in it. Dr. Lipschitz, shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake is a Japanese word, but there's an English word in there. References to Super Bowl 30 were censored because XXX, Roman numeral for 30, also can mean porn. And, Sussex, for a while, public school students could not get to the White House because there was a porn site called whitehouse.com. And so White House was blocked, including whitehouse.gov, the president's website. So unintended consequences. Sometimes best intentions fall foul. So remember, you can't spell psychoanalysis without that word, and you can't spell psychotic without hot. Okay, so let's see. Sometimes acts achieve counter-finality, that is, ends that are not intended. Be careful, because you can't always get what you want. Sometimes you get some other things into the bargain. The engineers have a saying: better, faster, cheaper. Choose two. That is, you can get something better and faster, and then it won't be cheaper. You can get it better and cheaper, but then it won't be faster. You can get it faster and cheaper, but then it won't be better. Choose two. So here's a common example. I'm voting for the death penalty. Why? Because it's what I want the death penalty to do. I want it to give justice to crime victims. Why should the murderer sit there in prison with 3 hots and a cot and cable TV for the rest of his life when my relative is 6 feet under? The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. Yeah, okay, that's the intention. But death sentences cost a lot more money than life in prison. And jurisdictional roulette is unfair. In Texas for the longest time, there were really no appeals. Forensic guilt was taken to be actual guilt. And if evidence surfaced after the trial, showing not only that the defendant did not do the crime for which he had been convicted, but could not have done it for various reasons, courts in Texas were just, sorry, he's guilty because the courts say he's guilty. That's what guilt is. And so a person in Texas was much more likely to be executed wrongfully just by virtue of the way the jurisdiction operated than, let's say, a person in many other states might be. And these are all unintended consequences of what intends to do something presumably praiseworthy, that is, get justice for crime victims. Al Capone, Prohibition. Outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol. Well, the idea was to curb drunkenness and social problems. You know, a working class guy goes and drinks up his paycheck at the end of the week, and then the family has no food. So cut off all the bars, and that'll solve that problem, right? But what it did was to empower the mafia. You know, when alcohol is outlawed, only the outlaws will have alcohol, including Joseph Kennedy. That's how the Kennedy family made its money in bootlegging during Prohibition. And supports illegal activities. Same thing with the prohibition of marijuana. You know, how's that working out? Gun ownership. Lots of calls to restrict gun ownership every time there's a highly publicized shooting. The idea is to curb mass shootings, which that legislation may not actually accomplish, but it does accomplish some other things. It disarms and imperils the law-abiding. John Lott, a researcher on this subject, since 1950, all but 4 mass shootings took place in gun-free zones. If you put up a sign that says, this is a gun-free zone, and I'm a bad guy with a gun, where am I likely to go? A place where I know that there are other people who might shoot back, or a place that's gun-free. It's a cliche, but when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. You actually think that criminals will obey gun control laws? You're a special kind of stupid, aren't you? Yeah, unintended consequences. And it gets worse. What if your chosen means entail consequences that are heartening to your enemies as they are to your friends? So after 9/11, get Al-Qaeda by any means necessary, Guantanamo, torture, extraordinary rendition. That is, if we're not willing to do the torture, we weren't up to a certain point, then turn these people over to our client states who are willing to do the torture on our behalf and say nothing about it. Okay, well, if you do that, and that's a harsh measure. That's really, no quarter given. Anyone caught up in the anti-terrorism dragnet is going to be hating life, but it undermines the rule of law in the U.S. It is just what Al-Qaeda loves. You see, these people are taking our brothers and putting them in prison without charge indefinitely, etc., etc. Blowback is the formal name for this. It's actually a book on how this worked. in Afghanistan, the Reagan administration in the 1980s supported the Mujahideen guerrillas because the USSR, the United States' worst enemy at the time, was occupying Afghanistan. So basically, they were the equivalent of the Viet Cong, and we were supporting the guerrillas resisting the occupation. This guy, though, was one of those guerrillas. So he came back to bite us in the ass. You know, you see a lot of motivational posters. When our actions are based on good intentions, our soul has no regrets. I have a multiple choice question for you. Multiple choice. The road to blank is paved with good intentions. Which fill in the blank? What happens when good intentions will lead predictably to an unwanted consequence? Okay. We talked about this in another context. POC James Anderson, United States Marine Corps, awarded Congressional Medal of Honor in 1967 for action in Vietnam. He threw himself on a grenade in a foxhole with his buddies. He absorbed the blast, killing himself, but saving his buddies. And his intention was presumably to save his buddies. Unintended consequence was to cause his own death. Presumably he didn't jump on the grenade in order to commit suicide, but bringing about his own death was a predictable consequence, although not necessarily an intended consequence of that. So did he commit suicide? Well, you know, and the way to argue that he didn't is the way St. Thomas Aquinas argues. If your primary intention is not suicide, then even though it's a consequence, you haven't done it. Collateral damage, and this happens all the time. So Robin Hood, I take from the rich and give to the poor, and wealth gets redistributed. That's what I want. As a side consequence, the law is broken. Although, again, you can come back on that and say, well, you know, it was stuff to begin with. I'm just doing redistributed justice. What if you might be expected to know that the collateral damage is stupid? Classic case, again, from Vietnam. Basically, we ruled the day, they ruled the night. The Americans and their South Vietnamese troops were quote, pacifying villages, and then when they would leave, the Viet Cong would come in at night and exact revenge on people who cooperated with the Americans and the Republic of Vietnam. So eventually, it was decided, in the case of this village, to burn the village in order to save it. So yeah, the village is saved from communism, but the village is destroyed, the villagers suffer. It's just sort of a classic textbook example people point to of just sheer stupidity. Yeah, you want to keep yourself from being murdered? Well, you can commit suicide, and that will preempt it, but some other catastrophes too. But really, do you want to do that? Are your ends appropriate to your means? Do you want to swat a mosquito with a shotgun? Yeah, probably your shotgun blast will blow away the mosquito, maybe. But really, means and ends. So far, we've considered the weaker claim, that is that everybody has good intentions. What about the stronger, that nobody's intentions are evil? And let's use the example of 9/11. These guys, did they intend to do evil? Did they say to themselves, I want to do evil? Well, their act was to fly a plane into a building. Their end was to kill crusading American infidels. And the unintended consequence, the collateral damage, was that a lot of other people died too, including some fellow Muslims. Okay, well, in warfare, one does have a manifest intent to kill the enemy, yes. And unless you're a pure pacifist, that is a position, a defensible position. Most of us aren't. Most of us, therefore, don't regard killing in warfare as evil per se. Okay, so was this warfare? Well, if it is warfare, it's not warfare against specific enemy combatants. You're not charging the other guy with a bayonet as he's trying to shoot you, for example. But it was a warfare against entire categories of human beings, all Americans, all crusaders, all infidels, etc. Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri signed a fatwa in 1998. It was based on this fatwa that the hijackers in 9/11 justified themselves. It's worth reading in detail. Praise be to Allah, who revealed the book, controls the clouds, defeats factionalism, and says in his book, quote, but when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war, unquote. And peace be upon our prophet, Muhammad bin Abdullah, who said, I have been sent with a sword between my hands to ensure that no one but Allah is worshipped, Allah who put my livelihood under the shadow of my spear and who inflicts humiliation and scorn on those who disobey my orders. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians, and military is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. Okay, so that's a pretty much of a shotgun approach. Probably the hijackers, if you could get hold of them, obviously can't, would deny that killing Americans was evil. What they intended to do was good. So they thought Americans deserve to die, crusaders deserve to die, infidels deserve to die. Maybe they were ignorant, but their intentions were good by their own lights. And the reference, of course, here is to the Crusades going way back. This is a trope that several sides use in this discussion. Some fundamentalist Muslims see contemporary secular society as simply a continuation of the Christian Crusades. And so infidels, secular as well as religious, are equally fair game. So one might well say, from the point of view of somebody who holds such a grudge, who thinks that general warfare carries out the aims of law and justice, well then, okay, the actions of the 9/11 hijackers, if you hold that point of view, proceeded psychologically from at least some descriptive sense of what the good is, proceeded from intentions to pursue the good as they conceived it. But if this is what they tried to do by their own lights, what was the content of their idea of the good? If bin Laden could be brought to trial and put on the stand, how would you defend bin Laden? What would his lawyer do? It's a tough job. His defense attorney would have to show, I think, that killing infidel crusaders was not evil, but good. And as payback, it was justice rather than injustice, that there was some grudge to be paid back and that he, in effect, did it. This would be to argue that genocide is or can be good. It is right for whole categories of people, Americans, crusaders, infidels, to be exterminated en masse. And it would also say that revenge could be justice, which again would have a hard time flying in certain legal settings. But could he pull it off? Or rather, is what the hijackers intended evil, even if they might deny that what they did was evil? Richard Dawkins said the following after the 9/11 hijacking. They might not be horrible people. They may be righteous people who believe they're doing right. I think the 9/11 hijackers all sincerely believed that they were doing the right and proper moral religious thing. They were not in themselves evil. They were following their faith. As you might imagine, Dawkins got a lot of flack for that, as if he were defending the hijackers and saying that what they did was objectively right. I take it that's not, if you know anything about Richard Dawkins, it's not likely to be what he's saying there. But of course, you know, like Bill Maher, who got fired for saying basically it took a lot of physical courage to fly those planes into the building. He was taken to be an apologist for the whole enterprise, and I think that's not what he's doing. He's not making a larger ethical claim. He's just describing their psychology. And Dawkins' point probably is that the content of such beliefs was itself evil, given, you know, if you know Richard Dawkins, he's one of the new atheists. That's probably where he's going with that. It certainly was the case that the shotgun captured lots of prey. In addition to the Americans killed, here's a list of people by nationality, not only from Crusader nations, but also Muslims from majority Muslim countries, and no doubt believing Muslims from non-majority countries in there as well. So here's the problem. My act is to fly a plane in a building. My intention is that crusading Americans and infidels will die. But the collateral damage is that lots of others die too, including fellow Muslims who I certainly don't, as a Muslim, I don't want to kill. So the means they chose were disproportionate to their ends. That's the shotgun approach to swat a mosquito. And the hijackers had to have known this. And possibly they would have to regard this disproportionate consequence as evil. They might say it's a necessary evil. You know, you got to do what you got to do. It's wartime, you know, extreme times call for extreme measures, et cetera, et cetera. The rest of us might well have to say, though, that their manifest intention was evil in any case, without qualification. Interesting. Here's a guy who, the guy who wrote Bin Laden's fatwa that I just quoted a little while ago, al-Mauritani. He opposed Bin Laden on the 9/11 attacks for this very reason. He said that there's going to be disproportionate casualties, including fellow Muslims. Don't do it. So there was some recognition on the part of that community, if not by Bin Laden and al-Zarqawi themselves. And then there's this guy. Oh, isn't that cute? You know, these two children may very well still be alive. I wonder what their lives have been like in the meantime. If what Hitler and the other Nazis intended is what Hitler and the other Nazis intended evil, even if they might deny that it's evil, or is it the case, as Isaiah Berlin said, well, you know, we agree to disagree. I prefer kindness. You, Himmler, prefer concentration camps. Different strokes for different folks. He is being sarcastic. If Socrates is to be believed, the difference between Isaiah Berlin and Heinrich Himmler is just an intellectual disagreement, which at worst Himmler is just intellectually mistaken, because he too should prefer kindness and would if he only thought about it a little more. One might even say, you know, even Hitler sought the good by his own lights. You know, let's make Germany great again, right? It's a good intention. What was the content of Hitler's idea of the good? Well, you know, one of the interesting things about the Holocaust is that we know that it was planned explicitly in 1942, near Berlin at Wannsee, in what's called the Wannsee Conference. Reinhard Heydrich was in charge. Adolf Eichmann participated, and the plans were laid out for the extermination camps, which very quickly began to be built in the Eastern territories. There does not survive any written order whereby Hitler says, send the Jews to the camps. Now, maybe several reasons for that. Maybe he didn't want to put his name on paper in case. Maybe he did put his name on paper, and lots of papers were destroyed as the Third Reich was crumbling. We don't have the whole story, but he clearly made his intentions known, even if he didn't sign an executive order that we can put our finger on and say, here it is. He says in the Reichstag, 1939, this is early in the year before he begins to invade Poland and start the war. Today, he says, I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation, the Vernichtung of the Jewish race in Europe. And applause, applause, applause. You can imagine. He wasn't the only one who thought this. Annihilation, Hass und Vernichtung unseren Feinden. This was Nazi party propaganda before they became under the thumb of the right wing, because they're after not only Judaism and Bolshevism, but also plutocracy and capitalism. But yes, you are an enemy. You will be annihilated. Now, given this background, did Hitler simply need anger management 101, or did he need to be sent to human relations sensitivity training? Was he just a vegetarian who needed a little more guidance? Would Hitler have gotten a pass if he claimed his intentions were good? Suppose he defines genocide, Vernichtung, as good when others define it as evil. Is he only pursuing the good as he sees it? Is the good always the same thing for everyone? Socrates seems to think that it is, and he seems to assume that we all have the same interests. But is it true? Is it true that the good is the same for all people? Is it true that all people have the same interests?
Springtime for Hitler and Germany. Winter for Poland and France.
Ah, yeah, springtime for Hitler. If you don't know the producers, the conceit is that a couple of guys put together a horrible Broadway show that's going to flop, and then they can run off with the investors' money, but they call it springtime for Hitler. But it becomes tremendous success. Well, what if what I desire is good for me and evil for you, but I desire it anyway? Springtime for Hitler is not going to be springtime for Poland and France, but winter, and that's predictable. Plato makes his character Socrates assume that what's evil for you is also going to have evil consequences for me, but is this always necessarily the case? If our interests are different, why can't I do harm to you when it benefits me to do so without harming myself? Benefit your friends, harm your enemies, and avoid harm yourself, as Maino says. If evil is a result of ignorance, will more education produce more goodness? Think again back to Leopold and Lowe. We talked about them. Highly educated people didn't stop them from committing murder. Indeed, the content of their education is partly what helped them do that. Likewise, the ideology of the 9/11 hijackers is propagated through religious schools. That's where they get these ideas, teaching that genocide is righteous as long as the bad guys suffer. Okay, so that is the first weird idea that that Plato has Socrates introduce in the Maino Dilemma. Let's go on. Maino has just said, that appears to be the true Socrates, and I admit that nobody desires evil. And Socrates continues, and yet, were you not saying just now that virtue is the desire and power of attaining good? Yes, I did say so. But of this definition, one part, the desire, is common to all, and one man is no better than any other in that respect? Clearly. It is obvious then that if one man is indeed better than another, he must be better in the power of attaining good? Exactly. Then, according to your definition, virtue would appear to be the power of attaining good? I entirely approve, Socrates, of the manner in which you now view this matter. Then let us see whether what you now say is true from another point of view. For very likely you may be right. You affirm virtue to be the power of attaining goods? Yes. And the goods which you mean are such as health and wealth, and the possession of gold and silver, says Maino, and having office and honor in the state. Socrates asks, those are what you would call goods? Yes, I should include all those. Then, according to Maino, who is the hereditary friend of the great king, virtue is the power of getting silver and gold. And would you add that they must be gained piously, justly, or do you deem this to be of no consequence? And is any mode of acquisition, even if unjust, equally to be deemed virtue? Not virtue, Socrates, but vice? Yes. then justice or temperance or piety or some other part of virtue would appear, must accompany the acquisition, and without them the mere acquisition of goods will not be virtue. Why, how could there be any virtue without these? On the other hand, the failure to acquire gold and silver in an unjust way for himself or another, or in other words, the want of them, may be equally virtue? True. Then the acquisition of such goods is no more virtue than the non-acquisition and want of them. But it seems that whatever is accompanied by justice or honesty is virtue, whatever is devoid of any such quality is vice. It cannot be otherwise, in my judgment. And were we not saying just now that justice, temperance, and the like were each of them a part of virtue? Yes. And so, Meno, this is the way you mock me. Why do you say that, Socrates? Why? Because a short while ago I asked you not to break up virtue and offer it to me in little pieces, and I gave you the patterns according to which you were to frame your answer, and you have forgotten already, and tell me that virtue is the power of attaining goods with justice, and justice you acknowledge to be a part of virtue. Yes. Then it follows from your own admission that virtue consists in doing with one part of virtue what a man does do, for justice and the like are said by you to be parts of virtue, each and all of them. Let me explain further. Did not I ask you to tell me the nature of virtue as a whole? And you are very far from telling me this, but declare every action to be virtue which is done with a part of virtue, as though you had told me the nature of virtue as a whole, so that I should recognize it even when you fritter it away into little pieces. And therefore, my dear Maino, I fear that I must begin again and repeat the same question, what is virtue? For otherwise, I can say only that every action done with a part of virtue is virtue. What else is the meaning of saying that every action done with justice is virtue? Ought I not to ask the question over again? For could anyone who does not know the nature of virtue know the nature of part of virtue? No, I do not say that he can. Do you remember how, in the example of figure, we rejected any answer given in terms which were as yet unexplained or unadmitted? Yes, Socrates, and we were quite right in doing so. But then, my friend, do not suppose that while the nature of virtue as a whole is still undetermined, you can explain it to anyone by reference to some part of virtue, or indeed explain anything at all in that fashion. We should only have to ask over again the old question, what is this virtue of yours? Am I not right? I believe that you are. Then begin again and answer me. What, according to you and your friend Gorgias, is the definition of virtue? Oh, Socrates, I used to be told before I knew you that you were always doubting yourself and making others doubt, and now you are casting your spells over me, and I am simply getting bewitched and enchanted, and I'm at my wit's end. And if I may venture to make a jest upon you, you seem to me, both in your appearance and in your power over others, to be very like the flat torpedo fish who torpifies those who come near him and touch him, as you have now torpified me, I think. For my soul and my tongue are really torpid, and I do not know how to answer you. And though I have been delivered of an infinite variety of speeches about virtue before now, and to many persons, very good speeches as it were, I thought, at the moment I cannot even say what virtue is. The analogy he's using here is the Mediterranean torpedo fish. It's kind of like our stingray, and also like our electric eel. We don't have this species in our part of the world, but that's what they're talking about in there. There's the torpedo fish on a vase. And Maino continues, and I think that you are very wise in not voyaging and going away from home, for if you did in other places as you do in Athens, you would be cast into prison as a magician. You are a rogue, Maino, and had all but caught me. What do you mean, Socrates? I can tell why you made a simile about me. Why? In order that I may make another simile about you. For I know that all beautiful youths like to have similes made about them. As well they may, since beautiful images, I take it, are naturally evoked by beauty. But I shall not return the compliment. As to my being a torpedo, if the torpedo is itself torpid as well as the cause of torpidity in others, then indeed I am a torpedo, but not otherwise. For I perplex others not because I am clear, but because I am utterly perplexed myself. And now I know not what virtue is, and you seem to be in the same case, although you did once perhaps know before you touched me. However, I have no objection to join with you in the inquiry. And how will you investigate, Socrates, that of which you know nothing at all? Where could you find a starting point in the region of the unknown? And if you happen to come full upon what you want, how will you ever know that this is the thing which you do not know? I know, Maino, what you mean, but just see what a tiresome dispute you are introducing. You argue that a man cannot inquire either about that which he knows or about that which he does not know. If he knows, he has no need to inquire, and if not, he cannot, for he does not know the very subject about which he is to inquire. This is what's called the Maino Dilemma. If you know, you have no need to inquire. If you don't know, you cannot inquire. So if you're like Socrates and you say, I don't know, what's the point of asking any questions? Again, it goes back to this distinction that we've examined before between something like episteme and something like gnosis. Gnosis, can knowledge be fuzzy and not always clear and distinct? You know, I can tell time, I can tell you what time it is now, but as St. Augustine says, I have no idea what time is, and we have not made any progress since St. Augustine's day. We talked earlier about objects of ignorance, you know, the entertainer, formerly known as the entertainer, formerly known as prince, formerly known as, et cetera, et cetera. We kind of know what that is, even though it's not transparent beyond that, beyond the symbolism. I have a pretty clear idea that there's an East Asian language in the center. It might even be Korean, I don't know. There are hieroglyphs on the right, but I can't read them. I have a fuzzy knowledge in all such cases. But Socrates is going to ask this question. Let's see. Meno says, well, okay, here's the dilemma you've posed. Is not the argument sound? And Socrates says, I think not. Why not? I will tell you why. I have heard from certain men and women skilled in things divine, and here Socrates pauses to change the tone of the dialogue. What did they say? They spoke, says Socrates, of a glorious truth as I conceive. What is it, and who are they? Some of them are priests and priestesses who have striven to learn how to give a reasonable account of the things with which they concern themselves. There are poets also, like Pindar, and the many who are inspired. And they say, mark now and see whether their words are true. They say that the soul of man is immortal, and at one time has an end which is termed dying, and another time is born again, but is never destroyed. And the moral is that a man ought to live always in perfect holiness. For in the 9th year, Persephone sends the souls of those from whom she has received the penalty of ancient crime back again from beneath into the light of the sun above, and these are they who become noble kings and mighty men and great in wisdom and forever called saintly heroes. Who was Persephone? Persephone, the Romans called her Proserpine, was the daughter of Zeus, Roman Jupiter, and Demeter, the goddess of crops and agriculture. Her Roman name was Ceres. We get our word cereal from that. And Pluto, Lord of Hades, Lord of the underworld, kidnapped her for his wife, took her down to his realm below. And Demeter came screaming down and said, I want my daughter back. And he says, okay, you can have her back as long as she's not eaten anything. And it turns out she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds. Now, first of all, how anyone gets by with eating just 6, I don't know. Fortunately, well, you guys are, well, at least my class is in California. I don't have to explain this. When I used to teach back east, I had to explain to them what a pomegranate was. We all know what it is. She'd eaten 6 seeds, so therefore she needed to spend 6 months of the year in the realm below, and then she could go up with her mother to the above the other 6 months of the year, which is why we have seasons. Demeter will not let the crops grow while she's separated from her daughter, so that's fall and winter. But then when she comes back, joins mother on top of the earth, then on the earth on the surface, then it's spring and summer and the crops grow. And that's why we have the 4 seasons, okay? And then Socrates continues in this kind of poetic vein. The soul then, as being immortal and having been born again many times and having seen all things that exist, whether in this world or in the world below, has knowledge of them all. And it is no wonder that she should be able to call to remembrance all she ever knew about virtue and about everything. For as all nature is akin, and the soul has learned all things, there is no difficulty difficulty in a man listening out of a single recollection all the rest, the process generally called learning, if he is strenuous and does not faint. For all inquiry and all learning is but recollection. All inquiry and all learning is but recollection. And here we come to the second of 3 weird ideas that Plato puts into the mouth of his character Socrates in this dialogue. It's known as Anamnesis. All inquiry and learning is but recollection. So there's no teaching. I can't give you anything. Socrates says this. I can't teach you anything. But By questioning, you can recall what you already know. So you already know everything there is to know. It's between these two flaps of skin on your head. Everybody knows everything, but we just don't recall everything. That's the problem. We need to remember again. That's what anamnesis means. Again, amnesis, the word for memory. It goes like this.
Since the dawn of philosophy, thinkers have argued about whether or not we have innate ideas, whether we are born knowing things, as Plato believed, or rather, as John Locke and other empiricists argued, the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes.
Yes, so Socrates is going to take this and use a little experimental or quasi-experimental logic if you want. Control for the effect of nurture, and the result can only be attributed to nature. And he's going to do this experiment in front of Maino and see what the result is. He continues, Socrates continues, and therefore, we ought not to listen to this heuristic argument about the impossibility of inquiry, for it will make us idle, and it is sweet to the sluggard, but the other doctrine will make us active and inquisitive. In that confiding, I would gladly inquire with you into the nature of virtue. Yes, Socrates, but what do you mean by saying we do not learn, and that what we call learning is only a process of recollection? Can you teach me how this is? I told you, Maino, just now, that you were a rogue. And now you ask whether I can teach you, when I'm saying that there is no teaching, but only recollection. And thus you imagine that you will expose me in a contradiction. Indeed, Socrates, I protest I had no such intention. I only asked the question from habit, but if you can prove to me that what you say is true, I wish that you would. It will be no easy matter, but I'm willing to do my best for you. Suppose you call one of your numerous attendants, whichever you like, that I may demonstrate on him. Maino says, certainly, come hither, boy. He is Greek and speaks Greek, does he not? Yes, indeed, he was born in the house. Attend now, and observe whether he learns of me or only remembers. Maino says, I will. So Socrates takes this young boy. He's not been educated, so he's not been nurtured. And therefore, anything he says will come from nature. And Socrates begins to draw some figures in the dust with a stick, geometrical figures, and asks the boy questions. Notice he doesn't feed him any information. He just asks some questions. Tell me, boy, do you know that a figure like this is a square? I do. And you know that a square figure has these four lines equal? Certainly. And these lines which I've drawn through the middle of the square are also equal? Yes. And a square may be of any size? Certainly. And if one side of the figure be of 2 feet and the other side be of 2 feet, how much will the whole be? Let me explain. If in one direction the space was of 2 feet and the other direction of 1 foot, the whole would be of 2 feet taken once? Yes. But since this side is also 2 feet, there are twice 2 feet? There are. Then the square is of twice 2 feet. Yes. And how many are twice 2 feet? Count and tell me. 4, Socrates. And might there be another square twice as large as this and having like this the lines equal? Yes. And of how many feet will that be? Of 8 feet. And now try and tell me the length of the line which forms the side of that double square. This is of 2 feet. What will that be? Clearly, Socrates, it will be double. Do you observe, Maino, that I am not teaching the boy anything but only asking him questions? And now he fancies that he knows how long a line is necessary in order to produce a figure of 8 square feet, does he not? Yes. And does he really know? Well, certainly not. He only guesses that because the square is double, the line is double. True. Observe him while he recalls the steps in regular order. Tell me, boy, do you assert that a double space comes from a double line? Remember, I'm not speaking of an oblong, but of a figure equal every way and twice the size of this, that is to say of 8 feet. And I want to know whether you still say that a double square comes from a double line. Yes. But does not this line become doubled if we add another such line here? Certainly. And 4 such lines will make a space containing 8 feet? Yes. Let us describe such a figure. Would you not say that this is a figure of 8 feet? Yes. And are there not these 4 divisions in the figure, each of which is equal to the figure of 4 feet? True. And is not that 4 times 4? Certainly. And 4 times is not double. No, indeed, but how much? 4 times as much. Therefore, the double line boy has given a space not twice, but 4 times as much. True. 4 times 4 are 16, are they not? Yes. What line would give you a space of 8 feet as this one gives you a 16 feet? Do you see? Yes. And the space of 4 feet is made from this half line? Yes. Good. And it's not a space of 8 feet twice the size of this and half the size of the other? Certainly. Such a space then will be made of a line greater than this one and less than that one? Yes, I think so. Very good. I'd like to hear what you say you think. And now tell me, is not this a line of 2 feet and that of 4? Yes. Then the line which forms the side of 8 feet ought to be more than this line of 2 feet and less than that other of 4 feet? It ought. Try and see if you can tell me how much it will be. 3 feet. Then if we add a half of this line of 2, that would be a line of 3. Here are 2 and there is 1, and on the other side there are 2 and also there is 1. That makes a figure of which you speak? Yes. But if there are 3 feet this way and 3 feet that way, the whole space will be 3 times 3 feet? That is evident. And how much are 3 times 3 feet? 9. And how much is the double of 4? 8. Then the figure of 8 is not made of a line of 3. No. But from what line? Tell me exactly, and if you would rather not reckon, try and show me the line. Indeed, Socrates, I do not know. Do you see, Meno, what advances he has made in his power of recollection? He did not know at first, and he does not know now what is the side of a figure of 8 feet, but then he thought that he knew, and answered confidently as if he knew, and had no difficulty. Now he has a difficulty, and neither knows nor fancies that he knows. True. Is he not better off knowing his ignorance? I think that he is. And if we have made him doubt and given him the torpedo's shock, have we done him any harm? I think not. We have certainly, as would seem, assisted him to some degree in the discovery of the truth. And now he will wish to remedy his ignorance, but then he would have been ready to tell all the world again and again that the double space should have a double side. True. But do you suppose that he would ever have inquired into or learned what he fancied that he knew, though he was really ignorant of it, until he had fallen into the perplexity under the idea that he did not know and had desired to know? I think not, Socrates. Then he was better for the torpedo's touch? I think so. Mark now the further development. I shall only ask him and not teach him, and he shall share the inquiry with me. And do you watch and see if you find me telling or explaining anything to him instead of eliciting his opinion. Tell me, boy, is not this a square of 4 feet which I have drawn? Yes. And now I add another square equal to the former one, yes, and a third which is equal to either of them, yes. Suppose we fill up the vacant corner. Very good. Here then, there are 4 equal spaces, yes. And how many times larger is this space than this other? 4 times. But it ought to have been twice only, as you will remember. True. And does not this line, reaching from corner to corner, bisect each of these spaces? Yes. And are there not here 4 equal lines which contain this space? There are. Look and see how much this space is. I do not understand. Has not each interior line cut off half the 4 spaces? Yes. And how many spaces are there in this section? 4. And how many in this? 2. And 4 is how many times 2? Twice. And this space is of how many feet? Of 8 feet. And from what line do you get this figure? From this, and he points. That is from the line which extends from corner to corner of the figure of 4 feet. Yes. And that is the line which the learned call the diagonal. And if this is the proper name, then you, Meno's slave, are prepared to affirm that the double space is the square of the diagonal? Certainly, Socrates. What do you say of him, Maino? Were not all these answers given out of his own head? Yes, they were all his own. And yet, as we were just now saying, he did not know? True. But he had in him those notions of his, had he not? Yes. Then he who does not know may still have true notions of that which he does not know? He has. And so this is where gnosis comes in. We rule out nurture. Nature must be the cause. The boy always possessed this knowledge of geometry and it always must have known it. He who does not know may still have true notions of that which he does not know. Maino says he has. And Socrates continues, and at present, excuse me, hydrate. At present, these notions have just been stirred up in him as in a dream. But if you frequently ask the same questions in different forms, he would know as well as anyone at last, I dare say. Without anyone teaching him, he will recover his knowledge for himself. If he is only asked questions, yes. And this spontaneous recovery of knowledge in him is recollection, true. And this knowledge which he now has, must he not either have acquired or always possessed? Yes. But if he always possessed this knowledge, he would always have known. Or if he's acquired the knowledge, he could not have acquired it in this life unless he had been taught geometry, for he may be made to do the same with all geometry and every other branch of knowledge. Now, you say, has anyone ever taught him this? You must know about him if, as you say, he was born and bred in your house. And I'm certain that no one ever did teach him. And yet he has this knowledge. The fact, Socrates, is undeniable. But if he did not acquire the knowledge in this life, he must have had it and learned it at some other time, clearly, which must have been the time when he was not a man. Yes. And if there are always to be true thoughts in him, both while he is and while he is not a man, which only need to be awakened into knowledge by putting questions to him, his soul must always remain possessed of this knowledge, for he must either always be or not be a man, obviously. And if the truth of all things always exists in the soul, then the soul is immortal. Okay. This is the third weird idea in Meno, the immortality of the soul. Now, this is an idea which subsequently has become kind of a commonplace, at least perhaps until recent times, when we no longer have souls, but we have personalities. However, for people in Plato's time, this was an entirely new and very weird idea. What happens when we die? Well, to the Greeks, the conventional view was, for the hoi polloi, the many, that's most of us, it's ashes to ashes and dust to dust, and they do not end the tag in the sure and certain hope of resurrection. Exceptional people, nobles, heroes, demigods, have shades. Those shades are immortal. They will survive. Of course, after death, they will go to the underground, to Hades. And the route to Hades is the river Styx. There is a ferryman named Charon who will take you across, but only for a fee. Ever heard of the custom of putting pennies on a dead man's eyes? Well, that's where this comes from. You put pennies in the dead man's eyes so that when he meets Charon, the ferryman, he can pay him the fee to take him across. Because otherwise, if he doesn't have the money, then Charon won't do it, and then his shade will wander the earth eternally as a hungry ghost. And this is not good. But for most people, this was not the case. Plato introduces the notion of the soul, psyche, as it's called. It's the root word of our word psychology. And this is a foreign idea from outside Greece. It becomes very popular. Christianity popularizes it, the notion that everybody has an immortal soul, which is why Nietzsche refers to Christianity as popular Platonism. It is the view that popularized this particular philosophical concept and indeed lasted for many centuries. Now, there's a thread running through the Meno dialogue that's very un-Greek and yet it's going to constitute one of the major Greek contributions to Western civilization. It's a couple of things. Both men and women, if they are to become good men and women, must have the same virtues, okay? The conventional Greek view was no, men are men and women are women, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that sort of thing. Plato is beginning to ask, well, is the virtue of man the same as the virtue of a woman? Is the strength the same strength in man that it is in a woman? He's beginning to answer that, yes. That's very new. Also, this is beginning to suggest that there's an underlying humanity. Also, of course, the notion that everybody has an immortal soul and is equal in respect of that, which ultimately cuts across the empirical social stratification. But there's another weird thing that Socrates does with this this notion of anamnesis. For he, the boy, may be made to do the same with geometry and every other branch of knowledge. Okay, so the example Socrates gives is, here's this boy, he apparently doesn't have any education, maybe. He seems to know how to count and how to multiply, but apparently doesn't have geometry, and Socrates draws out from him just by questioning, not by feeding him any information, just by questioning what Socrates takes to be an innate knowledge of geometry, and therefore this shows that his soul, this innateness shows also that his soul must be immortal. It would be one thing for the boy to reinvent geometry. Geometry is analytic, okay? And so one can imagine that. The calculus, Newton and Leibniz independently came up with that, yeah. So if we had to reinvent those wheels for ourselves, given enough time, I suppose we could do it. Geometry, yes, but every branch of knowledge? It would be one thing for the boy to do this with geometry. What if you were asked a history question? Who won the Battle of Waterloo? Okay, this is why you could bullshit your maths and logic profs better than you can bullshit your history prof. If you don't know that Wellington and Blücher won at Waterloo and Napoleon lost, you're not going to figure that out by deduction from anything already in your head. Plato has this notion of knowledge, and this is why this notion is ultimately inadequate, which thinks of all knowledge as being analytic propositions. And we'll see, as we've seen already, Descartes has the same. We'll come back to Descartes after we finish with Plato. But is that really an adequate notion of knowledge? Is it an adequate notion, for example, to deal with the very central importance of science in our knowledge? Science changes. Science is not about eternal objects. Science is not about analytic propositions in the first place. So if you have an account of knowledge which limits that account to analytic propositions, you are therefore excluding a great deal of what really is human knowledge, from history to science to law to economics and so on and so forth. That is a very serious flaw. This is Popper's insight, basically, in his view about objective knowledge, which we talked about previously. A view of knowledge needs to be able to take into account the fact that knowledge does change. Anamnesis might work if knowledge is like Plato thinks it is, certain analytic grasp of eternal truth. But if knowledge is like Popper thinks it is, fallible conjectures and refutations, then making progress over time, then anamnesis breaks down. At this point in my face-to-face course, I do a card trick. And I can't do that for you here. The Zoom situation doesn't allow it. But basically, it's a card trick whereby I ask questions of I have one student volunteer, and I get them to give me answers in the same way that Socrates is doing this with the boy. And I will find that student's card. Inevitably, I will find it, because what I've done is arrange the trick in such a way that I'm leading that person by the nose to a point where I want them to be, and they have no sense during the process. It's a very effective card trick. No sense that that's what's going on. But can you lead a person through a process subtly without necessarily showing them being aware of it? And so is perhaps Socrates doing this with the young boy? If you've ever taken psychology, probably chapter 1, you've come across the story of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse, and he could count. His master would say to him, "Hans, count to 4." And Hans would take his front paw and go front foot. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, Hans, count to 7. He would do it. Amazing horse. But people noticed that Hans couldn't do this when the master wasn't there. And somehow we can't quite figure out how it is. The master must have been conveying some kind of subtle cue to Hans, maybe raising his eyebrows or breathing. I don't know. So something that Hans recognized, when he got to the point, he would stop counting at the correct number. So yeah, it's possible to do that. And the story of Clever Hans is told as a cautionary tale to beginning psychology students to beware of that sort of bias and unintended influence and so on and so forth. So, weird ideas in Meno. Evil is due mainly to ignorance. There is neither teaching nor learning. There is only recollection, the idea of anamnesis. And therefore, because of the anamnesis, the soul is immortal. Well, that's a lot of ideas packed into one dialogue. Anyway, congratulations. Now you have finished a second dialogue by Plato. When we come back, we will look at the work by Plato called The Apology, which is his account of Socrates' trial, and we'll finish that by reading the last little bit in the work called Phaedo. And when we're done with that, then we'll move on to arete. So, thank you, and see you next time.